Rick Crusher Dalton was a large man with a rugged appearance. He wore a leather jacket, sported a thick beard, and always had a mischievous grin on his face. Everyone in his biker gang admired him. He was their leader, the one who always had a fresh joke, a daring challenge, or a way to assert their toughness. That day, they cruised into a small, quiet town looking for a spot to unwind and have some fun. The sun was shining, and the streets were peaceful, just the kind of place where they could stir things up a bit. As they parked their roaring motorcycles in front of a quaint little cafe, people turned to stare. The townsfolk were accustomed to tranquil days, and a group of tough-looking bikers was not something they encountered often. Some patrons sitting at the outdoor tables lowered their heads, hoping the bikers would simply pass through. But Rick had other ideas. He craved attention, relished making people uneasy, laughed boisterously, and enjoyed proving that no one could intimidate him. Then, something caught his eye. Two well-groomed dogs sat patiently near the entrance of the cafe. They were stunning, strong, and calm, observing the world around them. One was a golden retriever with gentle, kind eyes, while the other was a muscular black and tan Doberman, sitting with perfect posture. Rick smirked as he watched them. He nudged one of his friends and chuckled. "Look at these fancy little pets," he continued. "They seem to be living a better life than us." His gang laughed. Rick always sought ways to show off, to amuse his friends, and to remind everyone that he was in charge. He thought it would be amusing to see the dogs jump, so without considering the consequences, he lifted his heavy boot and lightly kicked the golden retriever's side. Not hard enough to inflict real harm, but enough to startle the poor dog. The retriever let out a surprised yelp and stumbled back, its soft eyes filled with confusion and fear. The Doberman immediately stood up alert and protective, but was well trained enough not to attack. A hush fell over the street. People at the cafe gasped. A waitress dropped a tray she had been carrying, the clatter breaking the silence. A child holding an ice cream cone squeezed it so hard that the scoop fell to the ground. The whole town seemed frozen in place, shocked by what had just occurred. Rick laughed, pleased with himself. His gang chuckled nervously, unsure if they should join in. One of them muttered, maybe that wasn't such a wise move. But Rick wasn't concerned. It was just a dog, right? Just a little fun. What Rick didn't know, and what nobody in his gang realized, was that those two dogs belonged to Jason Statham, and Jason had been observing everything from inside the cafe. Inside the cafe, a man sat quietly at a small table near the window. He had a strong, defined face, the kind that didn't show much emotion, but his eyes conveyed a different story. He had been enjoying a simple cup of tea, taking in the peaceful atmosphere of the small town. The warm sunlight streamed through the glass, casting a soft glow on the wooden floors. Everything had been calm, almost perfect, until he heard the yelp of his dog. His hand, which had been holding the cup, froze mid-air. His sharp eyes lifted from the table, focusing outside. He saw his golden retriever step back, confused and scared. His Doberman stood tall and alert, sensing danger. And then his gaze locked onto the man responsible, the biker standing there laughing, acting as if what he had done was inconsequential. The man inside the cafe slowly placed his cup back onto the saucer, the soft clink of ceramic filling the quiet space around him. The cafe owner, an older gentleman with kind eyes, had seen everything too. His face turned pale as he realized what was about to unfold here. He quickly stepped closer to the man at the table and whispered, "Sir, I think that biker just made a significant mistake." Jason Statham didn't respond. He didn't need to. He simply stood up, his movements calm and controlled. He wasn't the type to raise his voice or create a scene. He didn't need to do that. His presence alone carried a kind of quiet strength, the kind that made people pay attention without him saying a single word. As he took a step toward the door, the people inside the cafe exchanged anxious glances. They knew who he was. They had seen his movies, heard the stories about his intense training, and his real-life skills in combat and discipline. This wasn't just an actor walking out the door. This was a man who had spent years mastering the art of handling situations just like this. Outside, the biker gang was still chuckling, but their laughter had already begun to fade. Something about the way the townspeople were reacting, how they weren't just scared but anticipating something to happen, made them uneasy. One of the younger bikers nudged Rick and whispered, "I think we should leave." Rick frowned. Leave? Over what? It was just a joke. But then the atmosphere shifted as shadow moved across the pavement. A tall figure stepped out of the cafe, his boots making a slow, steady sound against the wooden deck. Jason Statham's eyes were locked onto Rick, calm yet filled with something dangerous. Rick, for the first time that day, felt something unusual, unease. He had been in plenty of fights before, but there was something different about this man, the way he carried himself, the way he didn't rush, the way he didn't need to say a single word. It all sent a clear message. Jason Statham wasn't just angry. He was about to teach Rick a lesson he would never forget. Rick stood there still smirking, but his smile wasn't as confident as before. Something about the way the man walked toward him made his stomach feel tight. Jason Statham didn't rush. He didn't shout. He didn't make any threats. He simply stepped forward, his sharp eyes locked onto Rick's like a lion watching its prey. The town was silent now. People who had been minding their own business just moments ago were watching closely, some even holding their breath. The cafe owner stepped outside but stayed near the door, as if he wanted to see what would happen next, but also wanted a quick escape in case things escalated. Jason stopped just a few feet away from Rick and looked him up and down. The biker leader had his arms crossed, still trying to act tough in front of his gang, but there was a slight shift in his posture, a stiffness in his shoulders, a hesitation in his stance. "You kicked my dog," Jason finally said, his voice calm but heavy like thunder before a storm. Rick scoffed and rolled his eyes. "It was just a little tap, mate. Relax," he said, forcing a chuckle. His gang laughed along with him, though much softer than before. Jason's gaze didn't waver. He didn't blink. "You think it's amusing?" he asked. Rick shrugged. "Look, I didn't mean anything by it. Just having a bit of fun." He shifted his weight, suddenly aware that every eye in the town was on him. His gang was still behind him, but for the first time, he felt like he was standing alone. Jason tilted his head slightly, considering Rick's words. Then, very slowly, he took one step closer. Rick swallowed hard. There was no anger in Jason's expression, just quiet, controlled energy like a loaded spring ready to snap. "You want to have fun?" Jason asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "All right, let's have some fun." Before Rick could react, Jason moved. It was fast, too quick. 1 second Rick was standing tall, and the next he was stumbling backward, his balance completely gone. Jason hadn't even thrown a punch. He had simply stepped in, tapped Rick's foot in just the right spot, and swept his leg out from under him. Rick landed hard on the ground with a loud thud, his gang gasping in shock. The leader of the bikers, the toughest guy they knew, was suddenly lying in the dirt, blinking in confusion. Jason didn't even smile. He simply stood there looking down at Rick with the same calm expression. "Not so funny now, is it?" he said quietly. Rick scrambled to his feet, his face red with embarrassment. His gang was frozen, unsure if they should step in or stay back. The townspeople, they were now watching with barely concealed smiles. And as Rick locked eyes with Jason again, he finally understood something. He had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Rick scrambled to his feet, his face burning with humiliation. He had never been knocked down so easily before, especially not in front of his gang. His men stood frozen, unsure if they should jump in or pretend they hadn't seen what just occurred. The townspeople, on the other hand, were watching closely, some even whispering to each other. It was clear they had never witnessed anything like this before. Rick clenched his fists, trying to shake off the shock. He had fought plenty of times in his life, and he wasn't about to let some famous actor make a fool of him. He straightened his jacket, took a deep breath, and glared at Jason. "All right, tough guy," he growled, stepping forward. "You think you can embarrass me like that and walk away?" Jason didn't move. He stood completely still, his hands relaxed at his sides, his sharp eyes never leaving Rick's. "You want to try again?" Jason asked, his voice calm, almost indifferent. Rick didn't hesitate. This time, he swung his fist, aiming straight for Jason's face. But before his punch could land, Jason moved quickly, precisely, like he had already anticipated it. He sidestepped effortlessly, grabbed Rick's wrist, and twisted it just enough to make him lose control. In the same motion, Jason turned Rick's own momentum against him, pulling him forward and sending him crashing into a wooden table nearby. The table shattered under Rick's weight, plates and cups flying everywhere. His gang stared in disbelief, their leader now groaning on the ground. The cafe owner winced at the mess, but didn't dare say a word. Rick struggled to get up, but Jason was already standing over him, completely calm. "Still having fun?" Jason asked, tilting his head. In. Rick gritted his teeth, pushing himself to his feet once more. His pride wouldn't let him back down, not in front of everyone. He charged at Jason, hoping to catch him off guard, but Jason didn't even flinch. With one smooth motion, Jason stepped forward and delivered a quick, controlled strike to Rick's chest. Not hard enough to seriously hurt him, but strong enough to knock the wind out of him. Rick stumbled back, gasping for air, his hands clutching his chest. His legs felt weak. He had never felt this helpless in a fight before. His gang, now realizing their leader was completely outmatched, began to take slow steps backward. Some of them didn't even want to make eye contact with Jason. The townspeople? They were smiling now. Jason took a step closer to Rick, who was still trying to catch his breath. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even look angry. He simply said, "You kicked my dog. Now you know how it feels." Rick's heart pounded. For the first time, he wasn't just embarrassed. He was afraid. Rick took a shaky breath, trying to steady himself. His chest still hurt from the last hit, and his mind was racing. How was this even possible? He had been in plenty of fights before, but this was different. Jason Statham wasn't just strong. He was fast, precise, and completely in control. His gang was still standing nearby, but none of them made a move. They had come into town thinking they were the toughest ones here, but now they weren't so sure. The way Jason had handled Rick so effortlessly, without even breaking a sweat, was enough to make them rethink everything. Rick wiped his face and tried to regain his confidence. He was still the leader of this gang, and he couldn't let them see him like this. His pride wouldn't allow it, but deep down he knew he had already lost. Then out of desperation, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small pocket knife. He flicked it open and held it in front of him, his breathing heavy, his grip tight. The moment the blade appeared, the entire town gasped. People stepped back, some even whispering to each other. A few looked toward Jason, wondering if he would back down now that a weapon was involved. But Jason, he didn't even flinch. Instead, he sighed and shook his head. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" he said, his voice steady and calm. Rick tightened his jaw. He didn't care if Jason was a movie star or some kind of martial arts expert. He couldn't walk away looking weak. He had to do something. With a quick movement, he lunged forward, aiming the knife straight at Jason's side. But once again, Jason was faster. Before Rick could even complete the motion, Jason's hand shot forward, grabbing Rick's wrist in a tight grip. In one smooth motion, he twisted Rick's arm, forcing the biker to drop the knife onto the ground with a loud clink. Rick let out a sharp gasp. His wrist burned, and his knees almost buckled under the sudden pressure. Jason tightened his grip just enough to ensure Rick understood one thing. He was completely powerless. The entire street was silent now. The gang watched in stunned disbelief. The townspeople stared, some with wide eyes, others with small, knowing smiles. "Ericla." Jason leaned in slightly and spoke in a low voice, just loud enough for Rick to hear. "That's how it feels to be helpless," he said. "Now imagine how my dog felt." Rick didn't say a word. He couldn't. He was too busy trying not to shake. Jason held his gaze for another moment before finally releasing his wrist and stepping back. The knife lay still on the ground, but Rick didn't dare to pick it up. For the first time in his life, Rick didn't want to fight anymore. Rick stood frozen, his wrist still aching from Jason's grip, his breathing heavy, his mind racing. This wasn't how today was supposed to go. He had come into town with his gang expecting to have fun, to show off, to be the toughest guy around, but now he was the one being humiliated. His knife lay on the ground between them, but he didn't dare pick it up. He could still feel the power in Jason's grip, the control in his movements. This wasn't a fight he could win. His gang, the same men who had laughed with him earlier, now looked at him with uncertainty. Their fearless leader had been taken down twice, and now he stood there unsure of what to do next. Jason didn't move. He didn't need to. His message was already clear. He had given Rick a chance to back down, but Rick had chosen to escalate things. and now everyone in town had seen the truth. Rick wasn't as tough as he thought he was. The golden retriever, the same dog Rick had kicked earlier, slowly walked up to Jason and sat beside him. The dog looked up at his owner, then turned to Rick with calm, intelligent eyes. It was almost as if the dog knew justice had been served. Rick swallowed hard. The silence was unbearable. His pride screamed at him to do something, to fight back, to prove he wasn't weak. But another part of him, the part that valued his own safety, was finally speaking louder. He took a slow step back, then another. His hands were shaking, though he tried to hide it. "Let's go," he muttered, not looking at his gang. His men hesitated, unsure if they should follow or wait for something else to happen. But when they saw the way Rick avoided Jason's eyes, they understood their leader had given up. One by one, the bikers stepped back toward their motorcycles. The townspeople, who had been holding their breath, began to relax, some of them whispering to each other while others simply watched in quiet amusement. Rick turned away, heading for his bike. He didn't even bother picking up his knife, he just wanted to leave. But just as he reached his motorcycle, Jason spoke one last time. "Next time," Jason said, his voice calm but firm. "Think before you try to prove how tough you are." Rick clenched his jaw but didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. With a loud roar, the bikers started their engines. The sound echoed through the street, but it wasn't the powerful, confident noise they had arrived with. This time it sounded like defeat, and as they rode away, leaving behind the small town and the man who had humbled them, Rick knew one thing for sure. He would never forget this day. As the roar of the motorcycles faded into the distance, a sense of calm returned to the small town. The townspeople, who had been watching, slowly began to smile, whispering to each other about what had just happened. Some looked at Jason with admiration, while others simply nodded in quiet approval. The cafe owner stepped forward, wiping his hands on his apron. "Well," he said with a chuckle, "that was quite a show." Jason, who had been watching the bikers leave, finally turned back toward the cafe. He reached down and gently patted his golden retriever on the head. The dog wagged its tail, happy and safe. His Doberman stood alert beside him, still keeping an eye on the road, as if making sure the troublemakers wouldn't return. One of the shopkeepers, an elderly woman with kind eyes, walked up with a smile. "That was amazing," she said. "You didn't even have to do much, and you still taught that man a lesson he won't forget." Jason gave a small nod. "Some people think strength is about showing off," he said simply, "but real strength is knowing when to use it and when not to." The cafe owner shook his head in disbelief. "I don't think they'll be coming back anytime soon," he said, "and if they do, well, they'll think twice before causing any trouble." Jason didn't say anything, but his slight smile said enough. The golden retriever let out a happy bark, as if agreeing with the town's relief. A small boy, who had been watching from behind his mother, suddenly ran forward and gently patted the dog's fur. "Is your dog okay?" he asked, looking up at Jason with big, curious eyes. Jason crouched down, checking his dog once more. "Yeah," he said softly, rubbing the retriever's ears. "He's okay." The boy grinned. "Good, he's really cute." Jason chuckled and stood up, glancing around. "All right," he said, dusting off his hands. "I think I could use another cup of tea." The cafe owner laughed. "It's on the house," he said. "After what you just did, you've earned it." Jason nodded and walked back toward the cafe, his dogs following closely beside him. The townspeople watched as he stepped inside, still in awe of what had happened. For them, it had been a moment they would never forget. A stranger had come into town, not looking for trouble, not trying to prove anything. Just a man enjoying a quiet afternoon with his dogs. But when trouble had come to him, he had handled it without anger, without violence, just calm, controlled strength. And as the sun began to set over the peaceful town, everyone knew one thing for sure. Rick and his gang had messed with the wrong man. Days passed, and the town returned to its peaceful routine. The small shops bustled with activity. The cafe remained a favorite spot for locals, and the townspeople still talked about what had happened that day. Jason Statham had come and gone like a passing storm, but the lesson he left behind stayed with everyone. The cafe owner still laughed every time someone mentioned the incident. "I've seen plenty of tough guys come through here," he would say, shaking his head. "But I've never seen anyone handle a situation like that. Didn't even break a sweat." Even the little boy who had patted Jason's dog continued to tell his friends, acting out the scene with excitement. "And then," he said, "he just moved so fast, the biker didn't even know what hit him." Meanwhile, Rick and his gang had not returned. No one had seen them since that day, and the town quietly enjoyed the peace. The bikers had learned a hard lesson. Some people are not to be messed with. One afternoon, the sound of a motorcycle approaching made a few people look up nervously. But this time it wasn't Rick or his gang. It was just a lone traveler passing through, like so many before. The cafe owner smiled, welcoming the newcomer as he always did. The people of the town had learned something important. Not all bikers were troublemakers, and not all quiet men were weak. Some carried a strength that didn't need to be shown unless necessary. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the townspeople carried on with their lives, their small town safe once more. And somewhere out there, Jason Statham and his loyal dogs continued their journey, leaving behind only a story. One that would be told and retold for years to come. If you liked this video, leave a like, subscribe, and help us bring you more exciting stories involving celebrities. Here you will be updated every day on the world of celebrities. See you soon!